We were talking a little bit about the oath of office and the fact that when I go out and speak to people, I always carry a copy of the oath of office with me because I think it's important that Americans come to understand that those that represent them take an oath to uphold the United States Constitution. So every time we get a chance to visit, I tell people about this thing. It's a hot button for me.
Great. Now, new citizens have to take an oath. Does that mean that we, as natural-born citizens, already have the oath sort of in place?
Well, certainly new citizens do have to take an oath. But the fact of the matter is that most Americans never think about an oath. Now, 40 plus years ago when I went in the military, took an oath of office to sustain the Constitution. So those of us that have served in the military obviously took an oath also. But most Americans never give it a thought. And I don't know if you can say it's implicit with your citizenship, but certainly those that come here and become citizens must take an oath to uphold the United States Constitution. So I think that they ought to be loyal citizens also.
Do you think there's a problem with people being motivated to study the supreme law of the land, which is the Constitution, understanding their obligations to it? And why do you think people kind of have a mental block? Has Washington made it sound like it's too difficult to comprehend and understand?
Well, my position is that every American should be a constitutionalist. It's said that, well, I think it was Andy Jackson in his farewell address said that the price of liberty is vigilance, eternal vigilance. Now, we haven't been too vigilant as Americans. We have been far too trusting. And I think Americans of every ilk have allowed themselves to be captured. Now, Jefferson said that a nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. And consequently, we kind of have the kind of government we deserve. So we must return to this concept of restoring the foundation. And that's kind of the whole direction of my entire campaign, is to go back and make a restoration to the original foundation this nation was established on.
Sounds like a worthy campaign in more ways than one. So here we have the Constitution, and people are kind of have been intimidated and not really known what it means or understand it. But the intent, I think the intent, now that I've seen what I believe the intent is, it seems to be pretty clear what that is, or how to understand the Constitution, maybe, if that sounds right. What is the intent of the Constitution? What was its purpose, basically, simply?
The United States Constitution is the charter of the nation. It is all the rules of governance in terms of how the national government is granted power. The powers were few, they were well defined, they were specific and exact, and as I said earlier, it's a contract with the entire nation. When we hire someone into office, those people can look at that contract. If you're a legislator, you look at Article 1. That's your job description. And if you are outside that job description, what do we do to people in the workaday world if they violate their job description constantly? We no longer allow them to keep their job. And that's the problem we've got in America. Now, you asked a question a minute ago about how difficult it is to understand the Constitution. It is written in plain English. It's a very, very succinct document. And it's written in a form that people of average intelligence or even below average intelligence can easily understand. Now, what's happened in Washington is they've given the impression that, well, you've got to be a Philadelphia lawyer to be able to understand this. And it's not true. Common Americans, everyday Americans, from the very foundation of this nation have been able to understand and apply this document. In fact, I oftentimes refer to a document called the Catechism on the Constitution, published in 1828 for elementary kids, that is absolutely magnificent in helping young people even understand the Constitution. And I believe that all those that hold office, and certainly those that are holding degrees in law, would not be able to as easily explain that document as even elementary kids could 100 years ago, 150 years ago.
Would you say the Declaration of Independence is a good reminder or a good way to help us understand the Constitution? It seems the founders were very intent about people understanding the purpose or the intent of the document. And I think if we understand first the intent, and my understanding is the intent is to keep us free from government, and that the Constitution isn't something that empowers the government, but it's supposed to do quite the opposite. What are your thoughts?
Well, I always tell people the Declaration is the promise. It's the promise of liberty. And the Constitution is what delivers that promise. Now, of course, the Declaration was signed in 1776, and 11 years later we got the Constitution. Well, what the Declaration basically does is very succinctly define the purpose of government. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So we know that our rights come from God. It goes on to enumerate a few of those rights, and then it tells the purpose of government, to preserve those rights. So our rights come from God. Government is there to preserve those rights. And we've long since forgotten that. We're always creating rights now for people. But the problem with that is those rights need to be fulfilled by some other person. So it diminishes their rights. And we need to go back to that foundation. And the Constitution was written in such a manner to prevent that usurpation of power by any level of government ultimately, and certainly it did not grant the national government the power it is currently usurping over the people. So yes, the Declaration is absolutely essential for understanding the Constitution. They're together, they're synergistic. We can't have one without the other. One is kind of the spiritual growth of America, if you will, while the other one tells us how we're going to run this nation now.
What's there's some question with people have about the meaning of the word unalienable as opposed to inalienable. Is there a difference?
Well, there probably is a nuance of a difference that we can't get rid of them, or they couldn't be taken from us. But for our intents and purposes in this little discussion today, let's say that these are rights that are ours by default of being God's children. They are ours and cannot be taken away, and government is not supposed to take them away. And of course, unless we have created a challenge for society and violated some great moral standard. Now, obviously, we all have the right to move about and be free and to travel, and we could talk about Blackstone's position on a free man's right to do so. But if someone has proven themselves unworthy of such a right by violating by violence or by some theft or something like that, we remove that right to travel and to be free. But in general, if people keep their standard within the guidelines that are within a moral standard of a people, we have all our rights and they can't be taken away from us.
Are you saying that we all have those rights because we've been born, because we're children of God, basically?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And not only do we document that through the words of the Founding Fathers, but we go back to those that they learned from too, whether it's Montesquieu or Locke or Blackstone. They cut their teeth on those the words of those men. Now it's interesting, since I brought those up, I don't know as I need to belabor that too much, but the Founding Fathers, the three most quoted men in terms of the ones they looked to for wisdom was Locke and Montesquieu and Blackstone. And then beyond that, though, by probably at least an order of magnitude, they quoted the scriptures of their day. And it's interesting, when they quoted Blackstone and Montesquieu and Locke, very often those men were quoting some scriptural evidence of the fact of where they stood too. So this foundational principle of being God's children and trying to create government that is in conformance to his eternal laws, that was really at the forefront of their efforts to found this nation.
That's amazing. That's really something.
Well, it's more than something. It is more than just happenstance. This nation, I tell people when we're out speaking on the campaign trail, I say, this nation was born spiritually before it was naturally upon the face of the earth. It truly was. And we as a people have long since forgotten that. We think this is an economic nation or some such thing. And yes, the economics is part of this nation. But in large measure, it was based upon some great foundational principles that allow us to be free enough to have good economics. So the economics is important, don't get me wrong, but we can't be free if we're violating these baseline principles.
Well, apparently it wasn't just a belief in God that this country was based on, but the Bible comes into the oath as well. So there must have been a direct connection to the God of the Old and the New Testament. And the last question that I believe a candidate is asked before, should you become the next U.S. Senator, before you take your oath, will be about God. The question will be, will you affirm or will you swear your oath? And can you tell us a little bit about that and what you're going to do?
Well, I will swear before God. And in fact, if we get a second, I'd like to read for your viewers here the oath, because the oath that you take as one that accepts the office of Senate actually ends with the words, "So help me God." Now, the United States Constitution has that specific oath, as we talked about earlier, for the president to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It doesn't say, "So help me God." But George Washington, the very first president, when he took that oath, he added those words. And virtually every president, there's a couple of anomalies in there, has followed that tradition. Now, the concept is George Washington knew how he was using that term. He was asking for God's help in being able to fulfill this great and wonderful office he'd been given, but he felt inadequate to that. He knew he needed God's help. And so back in the 1880s, when the senatorial oath was legislatively created, they included that, "So help me God." And I think that we need to understand that we're taking